September 12, 1943. 28 nautical miles southwest of Casablanca, Morocco. The Atlantic Ocean stretched like hammered steel beneath a moonless sky, its surface broken only by the phosphorescent wake of a lone submarine cutting through the darkness at 14 knots. The U-617, a Type 7C U-boat, rode low in the water, her diesel engines thrumming with the mechanical heartbeat of a predator returning from the hunt. In the conning tower, Captain Lieutenant Albrecht Brandy pressed salt-stained binoculars to his eyes, scanning the horizon for the telltale glint of aircraft or the distant smoke of Allied convoys. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of fear that had become as familiar as the submarine's own steel hull. For 47 days, the U-617 had prowled the shipping lanes between Gibraltar and the Cape Verde Islands, part of Germany's desperate attempt to strangle Allied supply lines to North Africa. But the Atlantic had changed since the dark days of 1940 and 1941, when German U-boats had ruled the depths like mechanical sharks. Now, in the autumn of 1943, the hunter had become the hunted. Advanced radar systems, improved sonar detection, and coordinated air patrols had transformed the ocean into a killing field, where German submarines died faster than the shipyards of Hamburg and Kiel could replace them. The Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its climax, and men like Brandy could feel the tide turning with each passing day. The U-617's crew of 44 men had not seen sunlight properly in over a week, surviving on stale bread, canned meat, and the bitter coffee that kept them functioning through 18-hour watches. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the constant ping of Allied sonar and the distant rumble of depth charges that seemed to grow closer with each passing hour. Brandy himself had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since leaving the submarine pens at Brest 3 weeks earlier. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds since the beginning of the patrol, and his eyes bore the hollow look of a man who had seen too many of his comrades disappear beneath the waves. The submarine's war diary recorded their progress in terse clinical entries that belied the terror and exhaustion of their daily existence. 8 merchant vessels sunk, totaling 37,000 tons of Allied shipping. 2 destroyers damaged. 3 torpedo attacks that had missed their targets entirely. The precious weapons disappearing into the dark water like prayers unanswered. The mathematics of submarine warfare had become increasingly unfavorable to the Kriegsmarine, with German U-boat losses mounting exponentially as Allied anti-submarine warfare tech reached a level of sophistication that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Brandy lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. 03:15 hours. In less than 2 hours, dawn would break over the Moroccan coast, and with it would come the aircraft, British Wellingtons and Hudsons, American Catalinas and Liberators, all equipped with the latest radar technology and crewed by men who had learned to hunt submarines with the patience and precision of medieval falconers. The U-617 needed to find deep water and disappear into the crushing darkness of the Atlantic depths before the sun rose and exposed them to the mechanical eyes that swept the ocean surface with electronic precision. The submarine's navigation officer, Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Weber, emerged from the control room below, his face illuminated by the red light that preserved night vision. Weber was 24 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy at Murvik, who had joined the submarine service believing he would help secure Germany's victory in the battle for maritime supremacy. Instead, he had watched the war turn against them with the methodical inevitability of a mathematical equation solving itself. Weber carried a chart marked with their current position and the projected course that would take them into the deep waters west of the Canary Islands, where they might find temporary sanctuary from the aerial hunters that had made the shallow waters near the African coast a death trap for German submarines. Months earlier, in the officers' clubs of Brest and Lorient, German submarine commanders had laughed at British attempts to hunt U-boats using aircraft. The Royal Air Force's maritime patrol aircraft were considered little more than an annoyance, capable of forcing a submarine to dive, but largely ineffective at actually sinking their target. German submarine doctrine had been built around the assumption that aircraft posed minimal threat to a properly handled U-boat, particularly at night when visual detection was impossible and radar technology remained primitive and unreliable. The German Naval High Command had dismissed Allied claims about improved anti-submarine capability as propaganda designed to boost morale among merchant sailors who faced the constant threat of torpedo attack. They called the British Maritime Patrol aircraft flying milk bottle, slow, ungainly machines that posed little real threat to the sleek predators of the German submarine fleet. The Focke-Wulf Condors that provided reconnaissance for U-boat operations regularly reported encounters with British patrol aircraft that seemed to lumber through the sky with all the grace and menace of cargo transport. German pilots described engagements where British aircraft fled rather than press home attacks against U-boats caught on the surface, confirming the belief that Allied aviation posed little serious threat to submarine operations. Intelligence reports from captured Allied airmen reinforced this assessment, with British and American crews admitting that locating submarines at night remained virtually impossible despite advances in radar technology. The arrogance that permeated German submarine operations in 1943 was not entirely unfounded. For nearly 3 years, U-boats had dominated the Atlantic shipping lanes with a ferocity that had brought Britain to the edge of starvation and forced the United States to develop convoy systems reminiscent of the First World War. At the peak of their effectiveness in 1942, German submarines had sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping, destroying vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. The psychological impact of submarine warfare had been as devastating as the material damage, with merchant sailors facing mortality rates that exceeded those of frontline infantry, and entire convoys sometimes disappearing into the Atlantic darkness without leaving survivors to tell their story. But by September 1943, the technological and tactical innovations that would ultimately decide the Battle of the Atlantic had begun to reach operational status in sufficient numbers to fundamentally alter the balance of power between hunters and hunted. The U-617 represented the cutting edge of German submarine technology when she was commissioned in early 1942, but 18 months of warfare had demonstrated that technological superiority alone was insufficient to guarantee victory in the increasingly complex arena of maritime warfare. The submarine that had once been capable of operating with near impunity now found herself trapped in waters that had become a carefully orchestrated killing field, where every advantage lay with the Allied forces that had learned to coordinate air, surface, and subsurface assets with devastating effectiveness. The U-617 herself was a marvel of German engineering and industrial capability, representing the culmination of decades of submarine development that had begun in secret during the interwar period when Germany was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles from maintaining submarine forces. At 67 meters in length and displacing 769 tons when submerged, she carried 14 torpedoes and mounted an 88mm deck gun that could engage surface targets at ranges exceeding 10 kilometers. Her diesel engines could drive her at 17 knots on the surface, while electric motors provided underwater propulsion at speeds up to 7 knots for distances limited only by battery capacity and the endurance of her crew. The submarine's pressure hull was constructed from specially hardened steel capable of withstanding the crushing pressure of depths exceeding 200 meters, while her internal compartments were designed to maintain watertight integrity even when partially flooded. Her periscope systems provided exceptional optical performance, and her hydrophone arrays could detect the sound of ships' propellers at distances exceeding 20 kilometers under favorable conditions. Every system aboard the U-617 reflected the advanced state of German metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and naval architecture that had made the Kriegsmarine submarine force the most technologically sophisticated underwater fleet in the world. But technology alone could not overcome the fundamental shift in strategic circumstances that had transformed the Atlantic Ocean from a German hunting ground into an Allied lake by the autumn of 1943. The convoy system that had initially seemed cumbersome and inefficient had evolved into a highly coordinated network of merchant ships, naval escorts, and air cover that provided overlapping layers of protection for vital supply routes. High-frequency direction-finding equipment allowed Allied forces to locate German submarines the moment they transmitted radio messages, while improved radar systems had eliminated the nighttime sanctuary that had previously allowed U-boats to operate on the surface with relative impunity. The crew of the U-617 represented the elite of the German submarine service, carefully selected and trained to operate one of the most complex weapons systems ever devised. Captain Lieutenant Brandy himself was a decorated veteran with 3 years of submarine operations and the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, awarded for his success in sinking Allied shipping during the dark days of 1942, when German U-boats had achieved their greatest victories. His crew included specialists in torpedo maintenance, diesel engine repair, electrical systems, and underwater navigation, who had trained for months before being assigned to operational submarines. Many had volunteered for submarine service knowing that it offered the highest casualty rates in the German Navy, motivated by a combination of patriotism, professional pride, and the substantial bonuses paid to submariners who survived successful patrol. The technical specifications that defined the U-617's capabilities told only part of the story of submarine warfare in 1943. The human factors that determined success or failure in underwater combat could not be measured in horsepower or armor thickness, but rather in the psychological resilience required to function effectively while trapped in a steel tube beneath hundreds of feet of water, knowing that enemy forces above were actively hunting for any opportunity to send the submarine and her entire crew to the bottom of the ocean. The claustrophobic conditions aboard a submarine demanded a level of mental toughness that few men possessed, while the technical complexity of submarine operations required crew members who could maintain peak performance under extreme stress for weeks at a time. The U-617's war patrol had begun 3 weeks earlier when she slipped her moorings at the submarine base in Brest under cover of darkness, navigating the treacherous waters of the Bay of Biscay, while Allied aircraft maintained constant surveillance over the approaches to German submarine bases. The passage through the Bay of Biscay had become known among submarine crews as the Valley of Death, due to the concentration of Allied air patrols that made surface transit during daylight hours virtually suicidal. U-boats were forced to remain submerged during most of their transit, relying on battery power and emerging only briefly to recharge their electrical systems and receive radio communications from headquarters. The submarine's operational area lay in the shipping lanes between Gibraltar and the Cape Verde Islands, where Allied convoys carrying supplies to the Mediterranean theatre presented lucrative targets for German torpedoes. But the intelligence that had guided the U-617 to these hunting grounds had failed to account for the dramatic improvements in Allied anti-submarine defences that had been implemented during the previous 6 months. Where German submarine commanders had expected to find vulnerable merchant ships protected by obsolete destroyers, they instead encountered heavily escorted convoys supported by aircraft carriers and equipped with the latest radar and sonar detection system. The transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic reflected broader changes in the technological and industrial balance between the Axis and Allied powers that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Second World War. German submarine production had peaked in 1942, when the shipyards of Hamburg, Bremen and Kiel had delivered over 200 new submarines to the Kriegsmarine. But Allied shipbuilding capacity had expanded even more dramatically, with American shipyards alone producing over 1,800 merchant vessels in 1943, replacing submarine losses faster than German torpedoes could sink them. The industrial mathematics of attrition warfare had turned decisively against Germany, ensuring that every U-boat sunk represented an irreplaceable loss, while every Allied merchant ship destroyed could be replaced by 3 or 4 new vessels within months. The men aboard the U-617 understood these broader strategic realities with the clarity that came from witnessing the war's progression from the perspective of those who fought it at sea level. Radio communications from other submarines had become increasingly sparse and increasingly desperate as U-boat losses mounted throughout 1943. Submarines that had departed from German bases were simply disappearing, their final radio transmissions often cut short in mid-sentence as Allied depth charges or aerial attacks found their targets. The camaraderie that had sustained German submarine crews during their early victories had been replaced by a grim fatalism that pervaded every aspect of submarine operations. The first engagement that would ultimately doom the U-617 occurred on the morning of September 11th, when British Wellington bombers equipped with Lee light systems detected the submarine while she was recharging her batteries on the surface 30 miles west of Casablanca. The Lee light was a technological innovation that had revolutionized nighttime anti-submarine operations by combining radar detection with powerful searchlights that could illuminate targets at distances exceeding 1 mile. The system allowed aircraft to locate submarines using radar and then attack them using conventional weapons, while the submarine crew was blinded by intense white light that made effective defensive fire virtually impossible. The attack began without warning when the night sky suddenly exploded into brilliant white illumination that turned the submarine's hull into a perfect target silhouetted against the dark ocean. The crew of the U-617 had less than 30 seconds to react before the first bombs began falling, their explosions sending geysers of water and shrapnel across the submarine's deck. Brandy screamed the order to dive, but the Wellington's attack had damaged the submarine's main ballast tank controls, preventing her from submerging quickly enough to escape the aerial assault. Secondary explosions from the aircraft's depth bombs created concussive waves that buckled the submarine's hull plating and shattered gauges throughout the control room. The damage assessment revealed the cruel mathematics of technological warfare in 1943. The U-617's starboard diesel engine had been knocked off its mounting brackets by the concussion of near-miss explosions, while her steering mechanism had suffered hydraulic failures that left the submarine virtually uncontrollable. More critically, the attack had fractured fuel lines that were slowly contaminating the submarine's compressed air system with diesel fuel, creating a potentially explosive atmosphere that made normal operations impossible. The submarine that had been designed to hunt Allied shipping now found herself transformed into a wounded animal, seeking any opportunity to escape from waters that had become a carefully orchestrated death trap. Captain Lieutenant Brandy faced the kind of decision that submarine commanders had dreaded since the beginning of the war, whether to fight on the surface against overwhelming odds or attempt to reach neutral waters where his crew might survive as internees rather than casualties. The U-617's deck gun remained operational, and her crew included men experienced in surface combat who might be able to inflict damage on attacking aircraft. But the submarine's damaged condition made prolonged surface operations impossible, while her reduced underwater capability eliminated the option of simply diving and attempting to escape submerged. The choice facing Brandy was not between victory and defeat, but between different forms of destruction. The decision to run for the Moroccan coast reflected both the desperation of the U-617's situation and the calculating pragmatism that characterized the best submarine commanders. Morocco's status as a French protectorate under nominal Vichy control created ambiguities in international law that might allow German submarine crews to claim internment rather than face capture by British or American forces. The shallow waters near the coast would also limit the effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine weapons, though they would also prevent the U-617 from diving to escape aerial attack. Brandy's choice represented a calculated gamble that his submarine's damaged condition made unavoidable rather than a tactical decision based on any reasonable expectation of success. The final approach to the Moroccan coast took place during the pre-dawn hours of September 12th, when the U-617 limped through waters that should have provided sanctuary, but instead became the scene of her destruction. Allied radar operators had been tracking the submarine's movements since the previous day's attack, coordinating a pursuit that involved aircraft from 3 different air bases and surface vessels that had been vectored to intercept any attempt to reach neutral waters. The technological sophistication of Allied tracking systems meant that the U-617's location was known with precision that would have been impossible just 1 year earlier, eliminating any element of surprise that might have allowed the submarine to reach safety. The final attack began at 0447 hours, when a Hudson bomber operating from Gibraltar detected the U-617 using radar and began its attack run, while the submarine was still 8 miles from the Moroccan coast. The crew of the Hudson had been specially trained in nighttime anti-submarine operations and carried a full load of depth bombs specifically designed to destroy submarines caught on the surface. Their approach was coordinated with 2 Wellington bombers that had been circling the area since midnight, creating overlapping attack patterns that eliminated any possibility of escape for the damaged German submarine. The bombs that fell on the U-617 during those final minutes represented the culmination of 3 years of technological development and tactical innovation that had transformed aerial anti-submarine warfare from an experimental capability into a precise science. Each depth bomb contained 250 pounds of high explosive designed to create underwater shockwaves capable of crushing submarine hulls at ranges exceeding 50 yards. The timing mechanisms that detonated these weapons had been calibrated to explode at depths that would maximize damage to submerged targets, while the fusing systems had been designed to function reliably even after high-speed impact with water. The explosion that finally crippled the U-617 occurred when a direct hit from a 250-pound bomb struck the submarine's conning tower, destroying her periscope systems and killing 3 men instantly. The blast sent shockwaves through the submarine's hull that ruptured fuel lines, shattered electrical systems, and opened seams in the pressure hull that began flooding the forward torpedo room. More critically, the explosion jammed the submarine's diving planes in the surface position, making it impossible for her to submerge, even if her ballast tanks had remained intact. The U-6117 had been transformed from a weapon of war into a floating wreck in the space of less than 30 seconds. Captain Lieutenant Brandy's order to beach the submarine represented the final option available to a commander whose vessel had been reduced to a burning hulk that could no longer fight, flee, or submerge. The Moroccan coast loomed ahead in the growing light of dawn, its rocky shoreline offering the possibility of saving his crew's lives, even if it meant the certain destruction of their submarine. The decision to run the U-617 aground violated every principle of submarine warfare and guaranteed that the vessel would be lost, but it also represented the only chance of preventing the deaths of 44 men who had served with distinction in one of the most dangerous assignments in the German military. The final moments of the U-617's operational life unfolded with the mechanical inevitability of a complex machine destroying itself. Her damaged engines continued to drive the submarine forward at 12 knots, even as fires spread through her fuel systems and flooding gradually overwhelmed her pumping capacity. The men who had operated her sophisticated machinery with precision and pride for 18 months now focused their efforts on abandoning ship, while enemy aircraft continued to circle overhead like mechanical vultures waiting for their prey to finally succumb to its wounds. The submarine's hull scraped against underwater rocks with the grinding sound of steel tearing against stone, a noise that seemed to echo the death throes of German naval power in the Atlantic. Water rushed through openings that had been blown in the pressure hull, extinguishing fires, but also ensuring that the U-617 would never again operate as the sophisticated weapon system she had been designed to be. The crew members who survived the final attack found themselves struggling through surf that was contaminated with diesel fuel and debris from their own vessel, swimming toward a coastline that represented sanctuary of a sort, but also the end of their war. When dawn fully broke over the Moroccan coast on September 12, 1943, the U-617 lay half-submerged among the rocks like a wounded whale that had sought shallow water to die. Her conning tower protruded above the surface, at an angle that spoke of structural damage too severe to repair, while oil slicks spreading from her ruptured fuel tanks created rainbow patterns on the water that caught the morning light with incongruous beauty. The submarine that had been launched with such ceremony in Hamburg 20 months earlier had become another piece of wreckage in a war that was consuming the technological achievements of an entire generation. But the story of the U-617 did not end with her destruction in the Moroccan surf. The 37 crew members who survived the submarine's final moments found themselves facing challenges that submarine training had never prepared them to meet. Instead of the neutral internment they had hoped for, they discovered that they had landed in territory controlled by Free French forces allied with Britain and America. Rather than sanctuary, the Moroccan coast offered only a different form of captivity and the beginning of an ordeal that would test their endurance in ways that underwater warfare had never demanded. The realization that they had escaped death at sea only to face capture on land came to the survivors gradually as they struggled through the surf and attempted to organize themselves on the unfamiliar terrain of the North African coast. The men who had operated complex machinery in the artificial environment of a submarine now found themselves confronted with natural challenges that required different skills and different forms of courage. The ocean that had been their element for so many months had rejected them, casting them onto a hostile shore where their technical expertise was meaningless, and their survival depended on abilities that had nothing to do with torpedo-firing solutions or diesel engine maintenance. Captain Lieutenant Brandy retained command of his men even after the loss of his submarine, organizing the survivors into groups that could move more efficiently through terrain that none of them had ever seen before. The North African landscape that stretched inland from the coast bore no resemblance to the European environments where these men had been born and trained. The vegetation was sparse and unfamiliar, the heat was already becoming oppressive despite the early and the lack of recognizable landmarks made navigation impossible using the methods that had served them at sea. They were submariners without a submarine, sailors without a ship, warriors without weapons, in a landscape that seemed designed to test human endurance. The first day of their march inland revealed the cruel irony of their situation with mathematical precision. The men who had been trained to operate in the most technically advanced environment ever devised now found themselves dependent on the most primitive survival skills. Water, which had surrounded them in unlimited quantities throughout their submarine service, became the paramount concern as they realized that the streams and wells that might sustain them were kilometers apart across terrain that offered no shade and no relief from the African sun. The uniforms that had been designed for service in the controlled environment of a submarine became instruments of torture in the desert heat, while the boots that had been adequate for metal decking proved inadequate for walking across sand and rock. The physical challenges of their situation were compounded by psychological factors that threatened to destroy unit cohesion and individual morale. The men who had functioned as a precision team in the cramped confines of their submarine now found themselves struggling with the open spaces and endless horizons of the North African landscape. Some crew members began to show signs of the agoraphobia that sometimes affected submariners when exposed to unlimited sky after months of artificial environments, while others suffered from the disorientation that came from navigating by visual landmark rather than the instruments and charts that had guided them at sea. The march that began as an attempt to reach French colonial authorities, who might arrange repatriation, gradually transformed into a desperate struggle for survival as the survivors of the U-617 discovered that the North African interior was as hostile to human life as the depths of the Atlantic. The temperature rose steadily as the sun climbed higher, reaching levels that made continued movement impossible during the midday hours and forcing the group to seek what little shade they could find among the rocks and sparse vegetation. Water rationing became as critical as the fuel consumption calculations they had performed aboard their submarine, with each man's survival dependent on mathematical precision that allowed no margin for error. By the second day of their overland journey, the distinction between officers and enlisted men that had structured life aboard the U-617 began to break down under the equalizing pressure of shared hardship. Captain Lieutenant Brandy continued to make decisions and issue orders, but his authority now derived from the respect he had earned through his actions rather than the rank insignia that had defined his position in the submarine's hierarchy. The technical specialists whose knowledge had been vital to the submarine's operation now proved their worth through their ability to solve practical problems of survival, while the youngest crew members demonstrated resilience that surprised their more experienced shipmates. The navigation techniques that had served the U-617 during months of underwater operations proved inadequate for determining position and direction on land, where the instruments and reference systems of maritime warfare were unavailable. The men who had calculated torpedo intercept courses with precision found themselves guessing at directions based on the position of the sun and the sparse landmarks visible on the horizon. Their progress became increasingly erratic as dehydration and heat exhaustion affected judgment and coordination, transforming the disciplined unit that had operated a complex weapon system into a collection of individuals struggling with the basic requirements of staying alive. The water they had carried from their submarine was exhausted by the end of the second day, leaving the survivors dependent on finding natural sources that might not exist in sufficient quantity to sustain 47 men. The search for water became the organizing principle of their movement, with all other considerations subordinated to the necessity of finding sources that could keep them alive for another day. The irony of men who had spent months surrounded by water now dying of thirst was not lost on survivors who retained enough energy for such reflections, but the immediate demands of survival left little time for philosophical contemplation. The discovery of a small oasis on the third day of their march seemed like deliverance, but the limited water source could barely sustain a fraction of their number and forced decisions about rationing that tested the bonds of loyalty and comradeship that had held the crew together during their submarine. The spring that bubbled from rocks provided perhaps 50 liters of water per day, while the survival requirements of 47 men in desert exceeded 200. The mathematics of survival demanded choices that submarine training had never prepared them to make, and the unity that had characterized their service aboard the U-617 began to fracture under pressures that were more personal and immediate than anything they had experienced during combat operations. Some crew members argued for dividing into smaller groups that could survive longer on limited water supply, while others insisted that their only hope lay in staying together and continuing the search for more substantial sources of water or for settlements where they might find assistance. The debate reflected different philosophies of survival and different assessments of their situation, but it also revealed the extent to which their ordeal had begun to affect judgment and decision-making capabilities. The men who had operated as a coordinated team in the artificial environment of their submarine now found themselves disagreeing about fundamental questions of survival strategy. The decision to continue together as a single group reflected both practical considerations and the emotional bonds that had been forged during months of shared danger at sea. Captain Lieutenant Brandy's assessment was that smaller groups would be more vulnerable to the psychological breakdown that seemed to threaten several crew members, while the combined resources and skills of the entire group offered the best chance of overcoming the challenges they faced. More importantly, the loyalty and mutual dependence that had sustained them during submarine operations created obligations that prevented the abandonment of weaker or injured comrades, even when such abandonment might improve the survival chances of the stronger members. The fourth day of their overland journey brought encounters with local inhabitants that finally offered hope of rescue, though not the form of rescue they had originally sought. Berber tribesmen who discovered the surviving crew members proved willing to provide water and food, but their presence also meant that word of the German submariners' location would soon reach colonial authorities. The neutrality of French Morocco under the Vichy government had been compromised by Allied landings in North Africa during November 1942, and the territory was now effectively under British and American control despite nominal French administration. The realization that they faced internment rather than repatriation came as a shock to survivors who had endured 4 days of desert conditions, believing that their ordeal would end with a return to German territory. Instead, they found themselves facing indefinite captivity in prisoner-of-war camps that might be located thousands of miles from Europe. The war that had claimed their submarine and forced them into the desert had also eliminated any realistic possibility of returning to Germany before hostilities ended, transforming them from active participants in the conflict into spectators who would observe the remainder of the war from behind barbed wire. The French colonial authorities who took custody of the U-617 survivors faced complex legal and diplomatic questions about the status of German military personnel who had arrived on Moroccan territory under such unusual circumstances. International law provided limited guidance for situations involving submarine crews who had destroyed their own vessels to avoid capture, and the practical considerations of managing prisoners of war were complicated by Morocco's status as a protectorate rather than sovereign territory. The decision to transfer the German submariners to facilities administered by British forces reflected both military necessity and the political realities of Allied cooperation in North Africa. The journey from the Moroccan coast to prisoner-of-war camps in Algeria marked the final stage of an odyssey that had transformed the crew of the U-617 from submarine warriors into prisoners of war within the space of 1 week. The men who had operated one of Germany's most sophisticated weapons systems now found themselves traveling by truck convoy under armed guard through territories that had been contested between Axis and Allied forces just months earlier. The landscape through which they passed told the story of campaigns they had observed only indirectly during their submarine patrols, with abandoned equipment and hastily constructed airfields providing evidence of the massive military operations that had secured Allied control of North Africa. The prisoner-of-war camp at Oran, where the survivors were eventually interned, housed thousands of German and Italian military personnel captured during the North African campaigns, creating a microcosm of Axis military organization within the confines of Allied captivity. The submarine veterans found themselves among Luftwaffe pilots who had been shot down over Tunisia, Afrika Korps tank crews who had been captured at El Alamein, and Italian naval personnel whose ships had been sunk in the Mediterranean. The diversity of military experience and national origin within the camp created complex social dynamics that reflected the broader coalition character of the Axis powers. Life in the prisoner-of-war camp imposed its own disciplines and hierarchies that bore little resemblance to the technical requirements of submarine operations, but demanded similar forms of cooperation and mutual support. The skills that had made the U-617's crew effective submariners proved adaptable to the challenges of camp life, with technical specialists finding new applications for their expertise in maintaining camp equipment and organizing work details. Leadership responsibilities that had been defined by naval rank and technical qualification in submarine service were gradually redistributed based on practical ability and personal qualities that proved effective in the very different environment of captivity. The psychological adjustment to prisoner-of-war status proved more difficult than the physical adaptation to camp conditions for many of the U-617's crew members. The transition from active participation in submarine warfare to passive observation of the war's progress required mental changes that some men found impossible to accept. Radio broadcasts and censored newspapers provided limited information about military development, but the isolation from events that had formerly defined their lives created a sense of disconnection that affected morale and psychological well-being. Capitan Lieutenant Brandy's role within the prisoner of war camp reflected both his naval rank and the respect he had earned through his leadership during the submarine's final days and the subsequent overland journey. His responsibilities included representing his crew's interests in dealings with camp authority and maintaining discipline within the German naval contingent, but he also served as an informal counselor for men struggling with the psychological challenges of captivity. The leadership skills that had qualified him for submarine command proved equally valuable in helping his subordinates adapt to circumstances that no naval training had prepared them to face. The months that followed brought news of German military reverses that confirmed what the crew of the U-61 had observed firsthand during their final patrol. The tide of war had turned decisively against the Axis power. Reports of submarine losses in the Atlantic reached the prisoner of war camp through letters from families and official communications from the German High Command, revealing the extent to which Allied anti-submarine capabilities had evolved during 1943. The U-boat fleet that had once threatened to cut Britain's supply lines had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength, with experienced crews, like that of the U-61 becoming increasingly irreplaceable losses. The industrial statistics that filtered into the camp through various sources told the broader story of how the war had been decided by factors that went far beyond individual courage or tactical innovation. Allied shipbuilding capacity had reached levels that made submarine warfare ultimately futile, with American shipyards alone producing vessels faster than the entire German submarine fleet could destroy them. The technological advantages that had briefly given U-boats superiority over Allied escorts had been overcome by countermeasures that drew on the combined scientific and industrial resources of Britain, America, and their allies. For the crew of the U-61, these developments confirmed what they had experienced during their final patrol, but also raised questions about the value of their sacrifice and the meaning of their captivity. The submarine warfare in which they had participated with such dedication and professional skill had ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objective, transforming their expertise and courage into historical footnotes rather than decisive contributions to German victory. The realization that their specialized knowledge had become obsolete created psychological challenges that went beyond the normal difficulties of prisoner of war status. The technical innovations that had made the U-61 a formidable weapon in 1942 were already being superseded by developments that would have rendered her obsolete even if she had survived her final patrol. German submarine designers were experimenting with closed-cycle propulsion systems, advanced sonar equipment, and hull designs that would have doubled underwater speed and range. But these developments came too late to affect the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. The crew members who had mastered the technology of Type 7IC submarines found themselves in the position of specialists whose expertise related to weapon systems that history had already judged inadequate. The correspondence that eventually reached the prisoners from families in Germany provided personal perspectives on how the war was affecting the homeland they had left months or years earlier. Allied bombing campaigns had devastated the cities where many crew members had been born and trained, while rationing and conscription had transformed civilian life in ways that made their memories of peacetime Germany seem like artifacts from another era. The submarine bases at Hamburg, Bremen, and Kiel, where the U-61 had been built and fitted out, had been repeatedly bombed, with facilities that had once represented the pinnacle of German naval technology reduced to rubble and twisted steel. The news of Germany's surrender in May 1945 reached the prisoner of war camp at Oran through official channels that provided few details about the circumstances of the Reich's final collapse. For the survivors of the U-617, the end of the war meant that their period of active service had concluded definitively, but also raised questions about their future status and prospects for repatriation. The victorious Allies faced enormous logistical challenges in processing millions of prisoners of war and displaced persons, while the devastation of Germany's transportation and administrative infrastructure complicated efforts to organize systematic repatriation programs. The months that followed Germany's surrender brought gradual changes to camp routine and administration as military priorities shifted from wartime security concerns to post-war reconstruction and rehabilitation. The rigid hierarchies and strict disciplines that had characterized wartime prisoner-of-war operations gave way to more relaxed arrangements that acknowledged the changed political circumstances. For submarine veterans like the crew of the U-6117, these changes offered opportunities to begin the psychological transition from military service to civilian life, though the process of adjustment proved difficult for men whose adult lives had been defined by naval duty and submarine operations. The eventual repatriation of the U-617 survivors to occupied Germany occurred in stages throughout 1946 and early 1947, with individual cases handled according to criteria that reflected Allied policies toward former enemy military personnel. Kapitänleutnant Brandy was among the last to be released due to his officer status and the special screening procedures applied to submarine commanders, but his eventual return to Germany reunited him with family members who had survived the war despite the destruction of their hometown during Allied bombing raids. The reunion marked the end of an odyssey that had taken him from the depths of the Atlantic to the deserts of North Africa and finally to the ruins of post-war Germany. The process of adjusting to civilian life in occupied Germany proved as challenging as any of the ordeals the U-617's crew had faced during their military service. The country they returned to bore little resemblance to the Reich they had served, with Allied occupation forces controlling every aspect of political and economic life, while denazification programs scrutinized the wartime records of former military personnel. The technical skills that had made them valuable submarine crew members had limited application in a defeated nation whose industrial infrastructure had been systematically destroyed and whose naval forces had been permanently disbanded. Some crew members found employment in reconstruction efforts that drew on their mechanical and engineering expertise, working to rebuild the industrial facilities that Allied bombing had destroyed. The precision and attention to detail that had characterized submarine operations proved valuable in restoration projects that required both technical skill and the ability to work effectively under difficult conditions. Former torpedo mechanics became machine tool operators, electrical specialists found work in power plant reconstruction, and navigation experts contributed to the rebuilding of Germany's transportation infrastructure. Others struggled with the transition from military to civilian life, particularly those whose submarine service had been their primary adult experience and whose psychological adjustment to peacetime proved difficult. The camaraderie and clear hierarchies that had structured life aboard the U-617 had no equivalent in the chaotic conditions of post-war Germany, where traditional social structures had been disrupted and where former military personnel often faced suspicion from both occupation authorities and German civilians who blamed the military for the war's devastating consequences. Kapitänleutnant Brandy himself eventually found work as a maritime insurance investigator, applying his knowledge of naval operations and submarine warfare to assessments of shipping losses and marine accidents. His wartime experience provided valuable insights into the technical factors that could cause vessels to be lost at sea, while his understanding of underwater conditions helped insurance companies evaluate claims related to submarine warfare damage. The irony of using his expertise in submarine operations to investigate the very types of losses his submarine had once been designed to inflict was not lost on him, but the work provided both income and a sense of purpose during the difficult years of German reconstruction. The scattered members of the U-617's crew maintained contact through correspondence and occasional reunions that became increasingly frequent as the immediate hardships of post-war life gradually gave way to the economic recovery of the 1950s. These gatherings served multiple purposes, providing opportunities for former comrades to share experiences and support each other through ongoing challenges, while also preserving memories of their submarine service for younger family members who had been born after the war. The stories they told emphasized technical achievements and personal bonds rather than political ideology, reflecting both the passage of time and their desire to honor fallen comrades without glorifying the conflict that had claimed so many lives. The wreck of the U-617 remained where she had been driven aground on the Moroccan coast, gradually deteriorating under the combined effects of surf action and corrosion. Local fishermen occasionally recovered pieces of metal and equipment that had broken away from the main hull, but the submarine's strategic location in shallow water made systematic salvage operations impractical. The Moroccan authorities showed little interest in removing a wreck that posed no hazard to navigation and served as an unofficial monument to the submarine warfare that had raged throughout the Atlantic during the Second World War. Decades later, marine archaeologists would study the remains of the U-617 as part of broader research into submarine warfare technology and tactics, finding that the vessel's final resting place provided valuable insights into both German engineering practices and the effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine weapons. The damage patterns visible on the submarine's hull confirm the devastating impact of aerial depth bombing on submarine operations, while the configuration of her torpedo room revealed details about German weapon systems that had remained classified long after the war's end. The scientific value of the wreck site ensured its protection under international maritime heritage agreements that recognized its historical significance. The broader lessons of the U-617's story became apparent only as historians gained access to classified records and could analyze the submarine war in its full strategic context. The technological sophistication that had made German submarines temporarily successful had been overwhelmed by Allied innovations that drew on far greater industrial and scientific resources. The individual courage and technical skill of crews like that of the U-617 had proven insufficient to overcome fundamental disadvantages in production capacity, technological development, and strategic coordination that ultimately determined the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. The transformation of the Atlantic Ocean from a German hunting ground to an Allied lake had occurred with startling rapidity during 1943, reflecting the exponential growth of Allied anti-submarine capabilities and the corresponding decline in German submarine effectiveness. Statistical analyses conducted after the war revealed that the U-617's final patrol had occurred during the period of maximum danger for German submarines, when loss rates exceeded replacement rates by margins that made the ultimate defeat of the U-boat fleet mathematically inevitable. The crew's survival and eventual capture had actually been more fortunate than the fate of most German submarines operating during that period, many of which simply disappeared without any survivors to tell their stories. The human cost of submarine warfare extended far beyond the immediate casualties suffered by submarine crews and their target. The psychological impact on merchant sailors who survived torpedo attacks often lasted for decades, while the families of submarine crew members faced years of uncertainty about the fate of loved ones who had vanished beneath the Atlantic waves. The widows and children of submariners killed in action received minimal support from a German government that was itself struggling to survive military defeat and foreign occupation, creating hardships that persisted long after the formal end of hostilities. The technological legacy of submarine warfare proved more enduring than its immediate strategic impact. The innovations developed for submarine detection and destruction became the foundation for post-war advances in underwater exploration, marine salvage, and oceanographic research. Sonar systems that had been designed to hunt submarines found applications in commercial fishing and offshore oil exploration, while the materials science advances that had produced stronger submarine hulls contributed to developments in aerospace and deep-sea engineering. The war that had driven submarine technology to new levels of sophistication also ensured that this knowledge would find peaceful applications in the decades that followed. The moral complexities of submarine warfare continued to influence international law and naval doctrine long after the U-617 and her contemporaries had become historical artifacts. The unrestricted submarine warfare that had characterized German operations during both World Wars raised fundamental questions about the protection of civilian shipping and the rules of engagement that should govern naval conflict. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 had attempted to regulate submarine operations, but the realities of total war had made such agreements largely meaningless, leading to post-war efforts to develop more effective international mechanisms for controlling underwater warfare. The strategic analysis that emerged from studies of the Battle of the Atlantic emphasized the decisive importance of industrial capacity and technological innovation in modern warfare. The German submarine fleet had achieved temporary successes through superior tactics and equipment, but these advantages had been quickly overcome by Allied responses that drew on vastly superior resources and more effective coordination between military and civilian research establishments. The lesson for future conflicts was that technological superiority alone was insufficient without the industrial infrastructure and scientific community needed to maintain and develop that superiority over extended periods. The environmental impact of submarine warfare became apparent only decades after the conflict ended, as marine biologists studying Atlantic ecosystems discovered the long-term effects of underwater explosions and chemical contamination from sunken vessels. The thousands of ships and submarines that had been lost during the Battle of the Atlantic continued to leak fuel oil and other hazardous materials, creating underwater pollution that affected marine life across vast areas of the ocean. The U-617's final resting place in Moroccan waters was typical of hundreds of similar sites, where military debris posed ongoing environmental challenges that required international cooperation to address effectively. The educational value of submarine warfare history ensured that the experiences of crews like that of the U-617 would be preserved and studied by future generations of naval officers, military historians, and students of international relations. Naval academies throughout the world incorporated case studies of submarine operations into their curricula, using the tactical and strategic lessons of the Battle of the Atlantic to train officers for underwater warfare in the nuclear age. The technical innovations and human factors that had determined success or failure in submarine operations during the Second World War remained relevant to naval planners dealing with far more advanced weapon systems and operational environments. The memorialization of submarine warfare took various forms in the decades following the war, from official monuments in naval cemeteries to popular literature and films that attempted to capture the human drama of underwater combat. The crew of the U-617 was represented in several historical accounts that emphasized their technical competence and personal courage, while acknowledging the futility of their strategic mission. These accounts served to honor the memory of submarine crews on both sides of the conflict, while providing insights into the human dimensions of technological warfare. The reunion gatherings of U-617 survivors that continued into the 1980s and 1990s provided historians with valuable oral history sources that supplemented official records and helped preserve details about submarine operations that had never been formally documented. The personal accounts shared during these meetings revealed aspects of submarine life that technical manuals and after-action reports had never captured, including the psychological pressures, interpersonal relationships, and small details of daily routine that had shaped the experiences of men who lived and fought in artificial underwater environments for months at a time. The final survivor of the U-617's crew died in 2003, marking the end of an era and the transition of the submarine's story from living memory to historical record. His passing received notice in naval publications and local newspapers, but the broader significance of his death was the loss of direct personal connection to events that had helped determine the outcome of the Second World War. The technical knowledge and personal experiences that he and his shipmates had accumulated during their submarine service became part of the historical record rather than accessible through direct testimony, emphasizing the importance of preserving such accounts while witnesses remained available. The archaeological investigation of submarine wrecks like the U-617 gained momentum during the early 21st century as improved underwater technology made detailed exploration of deep water sites economically feasible. Marine archaeologists, using remotely operated vehicles and advanced sonar systems, could now study submarine wrecks with precision that revealed information about construction techniques, battle damage, and crew conditions that had previously been impossible to obtain. These investigations contributed to broader understanding of submarine warfare technology, while also providing insights into the human experiences of underwater combat. The strategic lessons of the Battle of the Atlantic remained relevant to naval planners dealing with contemporary submarine threats in an era when underwater warfare had been transformed by nuclear propulsion, advanced sensors, and long-range missiles. The fundamental principles of submarine detection and destruction that had been developed during the fight against the U-boat fleet continued to influence anti-submarine warfare doctrine, while the organizational and technological innovations that had enabled Allied victory provided models for coordinating complex military operations that involved multiple services and allied nations. The U-617's story exemplified both the technological sophistication and ultimate futility of German submarine warfare during the Second World War. The engineering excellence that had produced such an effective weapon system had been overwhelmed by Allied innovations that drew on superior industrial resources and more effective coordination between military requirements and scientific. The individual courage and technical competence of the submarine's crew had been insufficient to overcome strategic disadvantages that made German defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic mathematically inevitable once Allied countermeasures reached operational effectiveness. The transformation of submarine warfare from a German advantage to an Allied strength reflected broader patterns in the Second World War that emphasized the decisive importance of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and international cooperation in modern conflicts. The U-617 and her crew had been caught in this transformation, finding themselves trapped between obsolete doctrine and emerging realities that their training and equipment had not prepared them to address. Their survival and eventual adaptation to post-war life demonstrated human resilience in the face of circumstances that had rendered their military expertise irrelevant and their strategic mission impossible. The legacy of the U-617 lived on in the technical innovations that had been developed to counter submarine warfare, the historical lessons that had been learned from the Battle of the Atlantic, and the human stories that had emerged from one of the most technologically sophisticated conflicts in history. The submarine that had been designed to strangle Allied supply lines had instead become part of a larger story about how technological warfare evolved during the 20th century and how human beings adapted to the challenges of fighting with increasingly complex and destructive weapons systems. The desert that had witnessed the final chapter of the U-617's active service remained largely unchanged by the passage of time, its harsh landscape continuing to test human endurance as it had during the submarine crew's desperate march toward uncertain salvation. Occasional travelers still discovered pieces of equipment that had been abandoned during that march, tangible reminders of an episode that had transformed German submariners into prisoners of war and changed the course of their lives in ways that submarine training had never anticipated. The intersection of advanced technology and primitive survival challenges that had characterized their experience reflected broader themes in modern warfare, where technical sophistication could not guarantee success and where human adaptability remained the ultimate factor in determining survival. History isn't just written, it's remembered through those who still care to listen. The story of the U-617 and her crew reminds us that behind every technological marvel and strategic decision were human beings who faced impossible choices with courage and dignity. Their experience in the depths of the Atlantic and the deserts of North Africa speaks to the enduring power of human resilience in the face of circumstances that no amount of training or preparation could have anticipated. What story should we tell next? Subscribe to keep their memory alive. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps me keep making better content for you.